At 24,000 meters altitude, the sky isn't blue. It's an absolute, violent black, even at noon. The only sound inside the pressurized helmet is the pilot's ragged breathing and the static buzz of the encrypted radio. Outside, the temperature on the titanium skin tops 260 degrees Celsius, generated by the brutal friction against the thin air. But heat isn't the immediate concern. On the analog instrument panel, a red warning light flashes. The radar alert system screams a higher-pitched tone in the headset. Somewhere, 20,000 meters below, amid the dense clouds of North Vietnam or the icy edges of the Kola Peninsula, a Soviet SAA-2 missile battery has just locked onto a target. Their gyro-control radar has acquired the aircraft. The pilot doesn't touch the stick to evade. He doesn't instantly fire electronic countermeasures. He doesn't pray. In fact, his reaction contradicts every aerial combat instinct taught since World War I. He simply pushes the throttles of the two Pratt & Whitney JL-58 engines forward, to the full stop. The aircraft responds. It doesn't just accelerate, it devours the horizon. The speedometer climbs Mach 3.1, Mach 3.2, over 3,500 kilometers per hour. The missile that rose to kill the plane is now just a frustrated point of light, exploding kilometers behind, unable to work out the mathematics of an intercept against something moving faster than a rifle bullet. There are no weapons aboard this aircraft. No cannons, no missiles, no bombs. The only defense is pure physics. Speed and altitude taken to such an absurd extreme that the aircraft becomes untouchable. For 3 decades, hostile governments fired more than 4,000 missiles at it. None never hit. They called it Habu in Okinawa. The CIA called it Oxcart in secret documents. The world knew it as the SR-71 Blackbird. This is the story of the machine that turned the Cold War into a race the Soviet Union never managed to win. Before we reveal how the CIA had to deceive the Soviet Union itself to get this aircraft built, a quick pause. If you want unrestricted access to these historical files, subscribe to the channel now. And for our intelligence record, from which spot on the map are you operating today? Leave your location in the comments. To understand why a machine as absurd as the SR-71 had to exist, we need to go back to the exact moment when American invincibility died. It was the 1st of May, 1960. Until that morning, the Central Intelligence Agency operated under a simple, arrogant doctrine. Altitude was the perfect shield. They believed that if they flew high enough, the Soviet Union would be powerless. The U-2 spy planes, with their long glitter-type wings, crossed the Iron Curtain at 21,000 meters, photographing nuclear silos and bomber bases with total impunity. American pilots saw the Soviet MiG fighters down below, tiny and unable to climb to meet them. But Soviet technology was not sleeping. That fateful morning over Sverdlovsk, a radar-guided SR-72 guideline missile detonated close enough to the tail of Francis Gary Powers, USSR. Powers survived, was captured, and President Eisenhower was caught in an embarrassing international lie, claiming it was merely a weather plane that had gone astray. The game had changed. The sky was no longer safe. If the Soviets could reach 21,000 meters, then no secret was safe. In Washington, the panic was silent but total. The CIA needed a new response. It could not stop spying Cold War intelligence, depended on knowing how many missiles the enemy possessed. If altitude alone no longer worked, the new equation required a different variable. Speed. A great deal of speed. They needed something that could cross Soviet territory so fast that, by the time a Russian radar operator saw the blip on his screen, the aircraft would already be in another time zone. The job fell into the hands of Clarence Kelly Johnson, the legendary chief engineer of Lockheed Martin, who worked out of a secret hangar in Burbank, California, known as Skunk Works. Kelly Johnson was not just an engineer, he was a pragmatic visionary. When the CIA asked for an invulnerable airplane, he looked at the numbers and realized the challenge was not aerodynamic, it was thermal. Flying at Mach 3 times the speed of sound creates friction against the atmosphere so violent that the air in front of the plane ceases to behave like a gas and acts almost like a plasma torch. The nose of the aircraft would constantly reach temperatures above 300 degrees Celsius. The wing edges would become even hotter. That produced an impossible problem. Conventional aircraft were built of aluminum. At that speed, aluminum softens and loses structural integrity. If they built the plane out of aluminum, it would simply melt in the sky. Steel would withstand the heat, but it was too heavy. The aircraft would never leave the ground. There was only one metal on the periodic table capable of solving that paradox: titanium. It was as light as aluminum and as strong as steel, able to endure the thermal inferno of Mach 3 without deforming. And here lies the greatest and most delightful irony of the entire Cold War. In 1960, the United States had no significant reserves of titanium or rutile. The supply chain was non-existent for the industrial quantity required to build a fleet of giant aircraft. There was only one place in the world with an abundance of that metal. Only one country possessed the mines, the refining, and the largest-scale export of titanium: the Soviet Union. To build the plane intended to spy on the communists, the American government had to purchase the material from the communists themselves. It was one of the most audacious logistical intelligence operations in history. The CIA, working in the shadows, created a complex network of front companies and intermediary banks in the Third World. They pretended to be civilian buyers, manufacturers of assorted equipment, quietly negotiating with Soviet exporters. Ton after ton of high-purity Soviet titanium was dispatched to neutral ports, only to be secretly rerouted to Burbank, California. Moscow was literally selling the rope with which the CIA intended to hang it. The Blackbird is, at its molecular core, a Soviet aircraft reassembled by American engineering, but obtaining the metal was only the first miracle. Working with it would be a nightmare that almost bankrupted Lockheed. The titanium was temperamental, brittle, and rejected conventional tools. Ordinary drill bits snapped when trying to bore it. Welds failed. Kelly Johnson and his team had to reinvent the entire aerospace metallurgy from scratch. They discovered, for instance, that Burbank's tap water contained chlorine, which corroded titanium welds in the summer. They had to use distilled water. They found that cadmium-coated tools, common in any machine shop, caused corrosion in titanium. All such tools had to be banned and replaced. It was a project born of paranoia, fed by international smuggling, and built on a learning curve that cost millions of dollars per mistake. Yet the final product, the Oxcart, later to evolve into the SR-71, resembled nothing that had ever flown before. It didn't look like an airplane. It looked like a black dagger forged to cut the very fabric of reality. If you had the chance to walk up to an SR-71 parked on the runway in 1966, you would notice something unsettling. Something that would make any ordinary aviation mechanic panic. The plane would be leaking. Puddles of fuel would gather on the concrete beneath the black fuselage. It wasn't a defect, it was the design. And that brings us to the brutal reality of physics at hypersonic speeds. Kelly Johnson and his Skunk Works team faced an unsolvable thermal dilemma. When the Blackbird flew at Mach 3.2, air friction heated the airframe to absurd temperatures. The external surfaces exceeded 260 degrees Celsius, and the tail approached almost 600 degrees Celsius. Metal, even titanium, expands with heat. The calculations showed that, at maximum speed flight, the entire airframe would lengthen by roughly 10 to 20 centimeters due to thermal expansion. If they had built the fuel tanks perfectly sealed while the aircraft was cold on the ground, the violent expansion in flight would have torn the metal apart, blowing the plane up. The solution: they built the aircraft with clearances. The titanium panels were mounted loosely, fitting together like a loose puzzle. On the ground, fuel leaked through those gaps, but as soon as the plane accelerated and the heat expanded the metal, the panels swelled, closed the gaps, and sealed the tank perfectly. The SR-71 had to bleed on the ground in order to survive in the sky, and the blood it shed was not ordinary. Standard aviation gasoline JPA4, kerosene is volatile. If you filled a tank that heats to 200 degrees with ordinary fuel, the vapors would explode before ever reaching the engines. Shell Oil had to invent an entirely new chemical compound called JPO7. JP-7 was so stable and had such a high flash point that you could drop a lit match into a bucket of it, and the match would simply go out as if it had fallen into water. That solved the heat problem, but created another: how to ignite this fuel inside the engine to start it. The answer was triethylborane, or TIB, a pyrophoric chemical that detonates instantly on contact with air. Each engine carried a small tank of the hazardous liquid. When the pilot activated ignition or turned on the afterburners, the system injected a shot of TIB into the combustion chamber. The result was a characteristic emerald green flash out the exhausts, followed by the deafening roar of the Pratt & Whitney J8 and 58 engines. Those engines, incidentally, were engineering monsters in their own right. They were the only jet engines ever designed continuously in afterburner. But the real magic happened up front of them. Look at the Blackbird, and you'll see two pointed cones protruding from the air intakes. They're not decorative, they're the spikes, the inlet cones. In subsonic speeds, those cones stay locked forward. But when the pilot pushed to Mach 1.6 and beyond, an analog computer began pulling those cones rearward into the engine, up to 606 centimeters. This retraction served to capture and tame the supersonic shock wave, slowing the air before it struck the compressor blades. At Mach 3.2, the turbojet itself provided less than 20% of the total thrust. The remaining 80% came from the sheer pressure of air being crushed by the cones and expanding in the exhaust. The engine effectively became a ramjet. The aircraft rode on its own shock wave that it generated. It was a terrifying balance. If the pilot let the aircraft pitch too far, or if an atmospheric disturbance shoved the shock wave out of place, the phenomenon known as a unstart occurred. The airflow collapsed violently. The pilot's helmet slammed into the cockpit glass with the force of the sudden deceleration, and the plane yanked brutally to one side. Recovering from an unstart at 3,000 kilometers per hour demanded nerves of steel and reflexes trained to the limit. Nothing about this machine was friendly. Nothing was easy. It was built to operate in an environment where no human should be. And speaking of humans, the men who strapped themselves into those ejectable seats were not ordinary pilots. They were astronauts who had never left the atmosphere. Look at a photograph of the SR-70 pilots walking toward the aircraft. If you remove the black plane in the background, you'd swear they are heading for a NASA launch at Cape Canaveral. They wore full pressure, gold-colored suits made by the David Clark Company, identical to those used by space shuttle astronauts in the following decades. This was not vanity. It was a cruel biological necessity. The standard operational mission for the Blackbird occurred above 63,000 feet. At that altitude, the atmosphere is so thin that a human crosses the Armstrong line. It is the point where atmospheric pressure is so low that water boils at human body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius. Without that pressurized suit, if there were a cabin decompression, the pilot's blood would not only freeze, it would begin to boil in the veins and lungs instantly. Death would be grotesque and immediate. The suit was the only thing keeping terrestrial physiology functional, where nature said life should not exist. Inside that pressurized cocoon, the routine was one of almost religious isolation. While cruising at Mach 3.2, the radio silence was absolute. Reconnaissance missions over hostile territories demanded total discretion, but the view was something few human beings have ever experienced. At 26 kilometers altitude, the pilot could see the Earth's curvature sharply delineated. Below, the world was a distant blue and white map. Above, even at noon, the sky was not blue. It was a black abyss speckled with stars, merging with the dark violet of the stratosphere on the horizon. They were flying on the edge of space, yet the visual serenity contrasted with the thermal violence inside the cockpit. Even with the powerful air conditioning battling physics, heat radiated from the fuselage permeated everything. The triangular windshield, forged from high-strength pure quartz, glowed with the 300 degrees Celsius heat outside. Pilots reported that, if they pressed a moonlit hand against the glass, they could feel the burn searing through the protective layers of their flight suits. This perilous routine had a home base. Most real-world combat missions launched from Kadena Air Base on the island of Okinawa, Japan. It was there that the legend earned a name. Okinawans saw that strange, dark, flattened shape with a long neck, taxicab-like on the runway, roaring with a sound that made their chests vibrate. They said the aircraft resembled a native poisonous snake of the island. The Habu, the nickname stuck. Crews adopted it, emblazoning the snake on their shoulder patches. Flying the Habu became shorthand for taming the beast, and in Okinawa the tension was palpable. When a Habu took off, the entire base fell silent, not only because of the roar of the JI-58 engines ripping through the air in continuous afterburner, but because everyone knew where it was headed. It was heading north toward Vladivostok, or west over North Vietnam. It was heading to provoke the bear. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, Soviet radar operators were already waiting. They loathed the Habu not because it posed a bombing threat. They knew it was an unarmed spy. They despised it because it was an affront. Day after day it appeared on radar screens, drawing straight lines across the world's most guarded territory, while the Soviet Air Force, with all its missiles and interceptors, could do nothing but watch. But they tried. Oh, how they tried. For the Soviet Union, the SR-71 was not merely an aircraft, it was an existential crisis. Imagine being an air defense commander in Murmansk or Vladivostok. You have the most powerful radar in the communist bloc. You have nuclear missiles. You have fleets of interceptors. And, routinely, you see a bright dot on your screen crossing your airspace, licking your borders, and you know exactly what it is. Yet you cannot touch it. Frustration in Moscow rose to such heights that they built an entire aircraft just to try to kill the Blackbird, the MiG-25 Foxbat. The Foxbat was a brute-force monster. Built of steel with gigantic engines, it was designed to climb fast and fire heavy missiles. In theory, it could reach Mach 2.8 or even Mach 3 for short bursts, destroying its own engines in the process. It was a Soviet hammer trying to hit an American hypersonic needle. The SR-71 pilots saw this happen. They called it the game. The Declassified Flight Manual describes the defensive procedures with clinical coldness, but the reality in the cockpit was visceral. The radar alert system began to scream. The reconnaissance systems officer in the rear seat, monitoring the electronica warfare gear, reported, "We've got company." The Soviet tactic was desperate. Because the SR-71 was faster than the MiG-25 in sustained flight, the Russians could not chase the American aircraft from behind. They would never catch it. The only chance was a head-on intercept. Imagine the geometry of that encounter. The SR-71 tearing along at 3,500 kilometers AUZ. the MiG-25 coming the opposite way, or at a crossing angle at nearly 3,000 kilometers hours. The closing speed between the two aircraft exceeded 6,000 kilometers hours. They approached at almost 2 kilometers per second. For the Soviet pilot, the window to lock radar and fire a missile lasted only fractions of a blink. The missile's fire control system simply couldn't compute a shooting solution fast enough. Most of the time, the MiG pilot saw only a silver blur sweep past, leaving behind a sonic boom that shook his aircraft, and then silence. The target was already miles away, out of reach. But the real danger wasn't the planes. It was the ground-based missiles. In North Vietnam, where the Blackbird operated intensely, the SAF's-2 missile network was dense and lethal. Mission logs record moments when pilots visually spotted the smoky trails of missiles climbing like death's fingers trying to snatch them. There were days when multiple missiles were launched in a single pass. Air Force protocol was clear and rested purely on faith in Kelly Johnson's engineering. Stay on course, stay at speed, or accelerate slightly. A subtle, almost arrogant maneuver existed. When the system detected a missile launch, the pilot could make a gentle turn or climb a little. At Mach 3, that slight vector change forced the enemy missile to recalculate its path. The missile, already operating at the limit of its energy to reach that altitude, burned all its fuel trying to correct and fell inert into the ocean or jungle. Over more than 3 decades of service, estimates indicate that over 4,000 missiles of every type were fired at the various versions of the Oxcart program and the SR-71. 4,000 kill attempts. Number of hits, 0. No Blackbird crew member was ever lost to enemy fire. They did lose aircraft in accidents, mechanical failures, and test incidents, yes. But never to the Soviets. Never to the Vietnamese. Never to the Chinese. The aircraft created a bubble of invincibility around itself. It turned hostile airspace into its own private backyard. At the height of the Cold War, the greatest demonstration of power was not firing a nuclear weapon. It was flying unarmed over the enemy, snapping photos of its deepest secrets, and returning home for dinner, knowing they could do nothing about it. In the end, what killed the SR-71 was not a Soviet SAR-2 missile. It was not a MiG-25 interceptor. It was not a catastrophic Mach 03 engine failure. What killed the fastest aircraft in history was a far more mundane weapon, the budget. As the 1980s drew to a close and the Soviet Union began to crumble, the astronomical cost of maintaining a fleet of aircraft that leaked exotic fuel and required a support crew of hundreds became indefensible. Moreover, the sky had changed. Spy satellites now orbited the Earth silently, taking high-resolution digital photos without putting pilots at risk. Satellites were safe. They were persistent. But they had a fatal flaw the Blackbird never possessed. They were predictable. The Soviets knew exactly when a satellite would pass overhead and could hide their secrets, cover their tanks, or move their missiles minutes before the pass. The SR-71 had no schedule. It was the element of surprise. When the double sonic boom hit the ground, the photos had already been taken. Nevertheless, the decision was made. Retirement was announced. But the Air Force would not let its crown jewel fade away in silence. They planned one final act of defiance. On March 6, 1990, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Yielding and Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Vida took off from California bound for Washington, D.C., where the aircraft would be turned over to the Smithsonian Institution. They decided not just to fly. They decided to tear the record book apart one last time. The flight, which on a commercial jet takes about 5 hours, became a final demonstration of raw power. The Blackbird crossed the North American continent from coast to coast. Official flight time, 64 minutes and 20 seconds. The average speed over the route was 3,418 kilometers per hour. When they touched down in Virginia, the airframe was still crackling with the heat of re-entry into the dense atmosphere. The pilots shed their astronaut suits and handed over the keys to a machine that, even on that final day, outclassed anything any other nation could loft into the sky. Today, the surviving SR-71s reside in museums. They are cold. The titanium tanks no longer leak JPA-7 fuel onto the hangar floors. The cameras that once captured nuclear secrets now sit with their lenses capped. But if you visit the National Air and Space Museum and stand beneath the aircraft's looming, ominous silhouette, recall a disquieting technical fact. Since that last flight in 1990, no operational manned aircraft from any air force worldwide has flown faster or higher. We have regressed. The SR-71 remains a relic of an era when the terror of nuclear annihilation compelled us to build the impossible. It is the ghost of a war that never ignited, waged on the frigid edge of space by men and machines, who dared to be swifter than death itself. And to this day, it remains the unbeaten king of speed.